It's no surprise that Five Nights at Freddy's is still so huge despite the massive miss that Security Breach was. It sold well, and that's what counts. Because of those sales and the new approach to a younger audience, it would be easy as a developer to ignore fixing the big issues that left the older fans of the franchise alienated and frustrated, and instead continue making the classic mistakes most game development projects are at the risk of facing.
Oh my god. I'm such a What did I do?
It was quite the wait. In fact, the wait only made me more upset at the state of Five Nights at Freddy's, and I'm not alone in that. A huge case study released pinpointing the worst of Security Breach's flaws, how they were completely avoidable had there been proper guidelines and planning in place, and most importantly, how confident the developers seemed that their game was going to be a great game, despite what it ended up being, and still is today. To my great surprise, they did listen to those fans they had no real obligation to listen to. They took the extra steps to pay attention to the criticism surrounding Security Breach from the fans that were old enough to realize and scrutinize the faults of that game. They didn't have to listen. They made their money, but because they cared, they did listen. Maybe they were thinking about this logically through the long term. If we push away the serious fans by making poor design and story decisions, we might lose out on the money we could make from future games and media surrounding this monumental franchise. But I hope they were listening not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic is the proof I needed that Steel Wool does have what it takes to make a compelling narrative, an interesting setting, and a serviceable gameplay loop that takes what's already worked in the horror market and melts it together into an experience that takes what made Five Nights at Freddy's unique from a visual perspective and combine it with the popular 3D free roam fetch questy exploration filled gameplay that we're all used to. But it's just that we're already used to most of this. And while I'm happy that they've demonstrated the will to create a proper game, one that works and feels good to play from start to finish, these mechanics, these methods of narrative delivery have already been done in one form or another somewhere else. Does this make Secret of the Mimic another blunder? No, like I said, we're getting closer to the vibe and uniqueness of the older games, and they've truly nailed down the visuals here. But why is there mechanically no lasting remnant of what made those older games so unique? Yes, those older games that basically invented and popularized the sit and survive horror formula. The ones that remixed the ideas into special and unique sequels and prequels, ones that sparked a huge amount of fan support, fan games, and fan art. You can't make a fan game of Secret of the Mimic because Secret of the Mimic is already so derivative of existing horror game media. Now, I wanted to make a video on this game because something strikes me as fascinating about this game from a perspective of someone who's achieved UNC status, weathered by the knowledge of game development, but also someone who used to really love those older games some time ago. I haven't been following the lore as intensely as some other people in the fandom today. I'm older now and I don't have the time for it, and will probably have less time as I get even older, which is why I'm taking a similar approach as my last video about Deltarune, which you should watch if you haven't yet after subscribing. I'm taking a more casual approach here. This is a video about whether this game is worth your time or not and what could have been done better or completely hit the mark. But I am also here to theorize on my own, to give you all the conclusions I drew on my own, because it's important to see what I might have missed or interpreted differently. I won't add to the theories that already exist. In fact, I'm deliberately skipping 95% of them just so that I could draw some more personal conclusions that aren't clouded by bias or by my knowledge of existing theories. I also want to take a look at this game from a standalone perspective. Does this game rely on the player's knowledge of prior events, or does it attempt to tell a story that is self-contained and can be followed by someone who's trying out FNaF for the first time and starting here? Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic is not the return to form that I wanted, but it is in fact a steady improvement from Security Breach and even Ruin. So much so to the point that I actually thought this game was pretty scary and even pretty fun at times. It was definitely a step in the right direction for the franchise, and it improved those things that people didn't like about Security Breach, all while proving to us that a smaller scoped game with a respectable approach to the source material is exactly what they needed to get right for now. Now, my questions that I hope to answer today boil down to these two. Is this a good game? And is this a good Five Nights at Freddy's game? Originally, I wasn't even planning on making a full video on this game, but I thought that I had to because of how it remained fresh in my mind after playing it on stream, even now. You can't see me. My initial thoughts from halfway through the game were generally positive. I knew there were some shortcomings and nitpicks, and I didn't fail to voice them since they were right at the front of my head while I was streaming. People seem to generally think the same things about the game. The story was a bit hard to follow, but the gameplay was tense at times, and the set pieces were very well done almost everywhere. The puzzles were engaging enough and not too repetitive, but then I played the second half and realized there was a lot of repetition. With the elevator puzzle, the pipe puzzles, the security upgrade puzzles, while the mascot at the front of the game, Jackie, gone, never to be seen again. I couldn't help but notice things were looking a bit padded near the end, and for good reason. Disengage, elevator brake. It says complete all repair tasks. That was the last one? How long is this game, like 2 minutes? Playing this game on stream was the single worst decision I made in terms of finding what makes this game so great to talk about and dissecting it piece by piece based on what I managed to find over the course of a couple weeks. I also streamed this game coupled with the negative bias of knowing that Security Breach was the last game I played in the series before it, and I really did not like it. We have Monty and Chica.
Will result in suspension of your membership.
Where is he? Ah! I have no idea what's going on. Oh, what? What?
Dude, I was so genuinely confused in this moment.
Dude, I'm sweating. Like, I have no idea what's going on.
I had no idea.
I went into it with the notion of Steel Wool has this game to win me back over with, because I'm not thrilled to have spent 50-ish bucks on it. Rather than just giving them a chance to prove themselves, I went into it with a mostly pessimistic view that began to really boil in the second half, especially when everything just seemed to frustrate me more and more as I went in. It had a snowball effect of me just pouting about what I didn't like that overshadowed anything this game did good. I think that, like Deltarune, this is yet another game where your experience with it will be solely reliant on how much time you spend with it, exploring MCM, finding those secrets, and even backtracking, which I'll talk about quite a bit later. Knowing this, it's interesting looking back on my first impression of this game, clouded by negativity, and topped off with a casual playthrough where I failed to interact with the game's narrative and even the gameplay on a deeper level. When I returned to the game later with the goal of understanding it on its own terms, it was the best thing I did for the content of this video, because I now have the contrast of a player who's played the game casually, almost as casually as you can get with it, and a player who was genuinely interested in it. And that's what made me realize that this game is nowhere near as mid as I thought it was. So keep that in mind while I tell you about all my complaints before we get to the hopeful side of things. The first elevator repair was really awesome, and I remember feeling so engaged with the power fantasy of repairing something. It's a fun thing to listen to instructions and hope that you do things exactly as told. It was really interesting to see that some things about the instructions seemed to be purposely worded to confuse you or challenge you to think properly about the situation. However, they revisited this exact scenario 2 more times later on in the game, past the halfway point. It would have been a lot more satisfying trying to repair something else, like have me repair a spring lock issue while stuck inside a suit. It's been done in sister location, but I think in a 3D setting this would be really awesome. If you had to make sure you weren't moving too fast and crank dials and move things in place carefully as Fiona gives you a rundown of what workers that may experience a spring lock problem should do as a procedure. It also worked that there's this dolly animatronic that's riding on rails around the area. Maybe if she detects movement, you get jump scared, so you have to freeze what you're doing when she rides into the room at Mach speed to try and catch you off guard. It was sad that they felt like they had to repeat the elevator puzzle 2 more times, and the second time you do it is right next to the 3rd time. I think the spring lock stuff I said was a bit of wishful thinking, but something that could have been done to help bring this game back towards that sit and survive formula I was waiting to see again. We had to do an elevator puzzle 3 times, but honestly, it's not that bad when it repeats, and I'll get to that a bit later. He's right in between me and the door I need to use to get to. Oh my god, dude. How did he get stuck? This enemy is more or less the same throughout the whole game. Once you clock how it works and how to avoid it, it becomes tedious when backtracking and having to deal with it. Sometimes I can cheese areas by just running past it while it spawns in and entering a loading area that forces it to despawn again. In older FNaF games, we used to be challenged by having to figure out how our enemies worked in a strategic sense, even in FNaF 6, where all of them are identical to each other. Do I power through this printing task, or do I not risk losing the hard work I put into this night. In FNaF 2, Toy Bonnie is planning to enter my office through the right vent, and Withered Foxy is impervious to my disguise, but the puppet's music box has to be constantly wound. With the Mimic, the only thing that changes is the location, and the unfamiliarity that comes with a new area can really help make the Mimic stand out as an adversary if it weren't for the fact that otherwise it's the same enemy no matter where you are. The ways to deal with it are always the same too in these free areas. Don't get spotted, and if you are cornered or are in danger, run towards a locker and hide. If there are no lockers, look for vents and obstructive walls. It would have been very nice to have the Mimic take different forms that allow it to perform different actions, contorting its body and any suits it finds into weird shapes, like a crawler that lunges at the player, or can climb down from the ceiling, switching suits when you're not looking to provide that sense of paranoia that comes from not knowing what suit might begin its pursuit now. This game had a lot of fetch 5 objects to open the door type of sections. I'll give credit where credit is due. The visuals are combined with a lack of comfortability in a new area to make all of these stand out in my mind, but they're ultimately the same gameplay gimmick over and over again. Collecting the 5 spring love pieces is fine since it's the first time we do it, and it was cool having to do the little puzzles that left you vulnerable and look around and interact with the room to get to the pieces. The camera view can sometimes also help with finding these pieces, but not too much since they're very blurry as it is. The Mimic also gets faster the more you get these pieces, and chains dangling from the ceiling added a new threat, being able to make noise if you're not careful enough. Later on in the dolly section, we're doing the exact same thing again, but now there are no puzzles attached, just a couple levers to pull, which is a severe downgrade. There was also the part where you get introduced to Mimic Chica. She's twice as fast and a much bigger threat since you have to repair the pipe puzzle and then try completing it before she notices you're doing the puzzle. However, even if she got really close to where the puzzle was, I noticed that she never attacked me. Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to know if the Mimic caught you while you were doing the puzzle. Overall though, the threat of her being able to come in at any time and attack you while you're doing the pipe puzzle was quite a treat actually. On my first playthrough of the game, I noticed how stale the bit flipping minigame got by the third time. It was an attempt at an active puzzle and I got what they were trying to go for. It got progressively harder later, which is nice, but overall it's sluggish and difficult to understand, all because of the fact that you can't switch your row unless your arrow is moving, and it idles when it reaches the right side for a small amount of time that isn't really telegraphed or shown at all. Definitely frustrating, but not enough to make me want to go straight up play something else. I would have been really content if this was a one-time puzzle we had to do 3 or 4 in a sequence to get one upgrade in particular, not a minigame you have to do for every upgrade you get. Despite it getting harder, it feels like it doesn't challenge you enough anyway. It's too slow in its execution to be something that should be reused over and over again in the game. It would have been much more impactful if each security upgrade had its own unique override minigame, but that might have been out of scope for a project like this, and here's what we got. But with the more simplistic nature of the bit flipping game, it shouldn't have taken too long to implement a couple more games, even if we're just playing Tetris or Pong or Block Blast or something. It's fine, honestly. This critique is one of the more nitpicky ones, but it's something that's worth bringing up since it's yet another case of this game's unfortunate repetition. That makes me wonder why it costs a whole $50 when I could just go play Repo for $12 and get so many hours out of it. Repetition in video games is fine, especially if it's iterative, like in the fetching segments and even the elevator, but Secret of the Mimic thus far has demonstrated to me that the developers were too scared or too short on time to actually make a lot of these puzzles unique and truly a one-time thing, something that can stick out in the player's minds even further, even if they were just restricted to one area of the game. Like in Deltarune, which I might harken back to quite a bit since that video took so long to make, and there's some nice and surprising comparisons to draw between these two completely different games. In Deltarune, having the annoying mouse rooms be part of Chapter 2 only was a clever idea, especially since it's also a cool gag, something that's increasing properly in difficulty as you go, subverts expectations, and provides some narrative context we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. FNaF's more silent form of storytelling removes most of the game's freedom to make the puzzles any more than a functional thing, an obstacle that you're meant to figure out. Sure, I was a bit surprised to see that some pipe puzzle segments were ripped out and scattered around a small area, but they just combined the fetch quest format with the pipe puzzles. Nothing else is really new about them other than the setting they put those elements in, and they repeat the pipe puzzle fetch quest combo more than once in the game. Elevators were good in the first half because there's only one in the first half, but when there were 2 more elevator sections it got a bit tedious, but even then, the second part had its own unique little details too, which again, I'd love to touch on later when I get more positive. I want to mention now that most of these puzzles aren't too bad to begin with, which means they mostly get a pass for me. The repetition I'm more upset about comes from puzzles that I haven't really spoken about yet. I thought an elevator being repeated 3 times was bad. Here's something better. Codes. The unfathomable amount of codes and stupid code-related puzzles. This is just so lazy. I found myself being so upset having to look for codes to doors, and some solutions are way too convoluted to figure out without using a pen and paper, and deciphering things, or just getting really lucky and stumbling onto the clues you need to complete it. Going into this game, I wasn't aware that I'd have to decipher codes to unlock doors and reach the secrets I wanted to reach, so naturally, I didn't. I just kept pressing on and interacting minimally with the code doors because of my heavy disdain for codes. Check the camera in the security office. Yeah, you right, dude. 26294. 6, 2, 9. That looked like a 4 to me. Sorry. It's always all about the, oh, I locked this door because someone kept taking my cookies. The code is 2048. Now no one will ever take my cookies again. These code doors also barely make any sense. Why were these code puzzles and rotating CCTV footage left here? By whom? For what purpose outside of gameplay? It takes me completely out of it. And the fact that they repeat it about a dozen times more is just the worst part, puzzle-wise, about this game. Codes in this game are an example of a cheap riddle, since they're either not executed correctly or they're boring when executed right, which means they're never executed right. Not only that, but the pipe puzzle is only saved by the interesting hand mechanic, which I'll also touch upon later. They don't even feel unique in their own right. It's the only thing that brought down one of my favorite segments of the game, which thankfully is such a good set piece that I still think it's a real standout moment. It made me feel a bit disappointed as a player to see that a lot of these things that could have been unique moments and puzzles are degraded to these reused and recycled gameplay mechanics that get tiresome after the third occurrence. To a casual player, this is the bulk of their experience and understanding of this game from a gameplay perspective. When I played this game in a casual way, I got nothing I genuinely seemed to want out of it. It made me feel like I might have even wasted my money on this game. Truth be told, this game is almost identical to other mascot horror games on the market, like Poppy Playtime, which is why for a casual player, it might seem completely unappealing. You get your chase sequence, you get your cutscenes, you get your darkness, you get your free roam stealth sections, and you even get your basic puzzles that are things that have been used before. Thusly, these things aren't there to challenge much of your critical thinking skills, but are rather there to stuff the turkey, so to speak. Resident Evil's puzzles were memorable because they had you examining your surroundings and interacting with the world beyond just looking at it through your screen. You were looking at statues with missing features, doors with shaped locks on them, enemies with clear weaknesses despite being so terrifying at the same time. The game is riddled with riddles and solid segments that try their best to get the player to really think and even backtrack to older areas in search of the pieces to these puzzles. Which brings me to my next point, the missed potential of this game's map. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that it's much smaller than Security Breach's map. Its smaller size is actually a breath of fresh air in an industry that's largely prioritizing making its games bigger and better than ever. There are still so many different places in Murray's Costume Manor, and the Data Diver is a great way to close off areas and gate them behind security protocols. It's also a fairly simple way to do so. With the security levels and these wonderful interconnected rooms, there was so much that pointed with an index finger and a shocked expression towards this game having a more Metroidvania-styled approach. My first and surface level playthrough left me wanting exactly that, since I was essentially moving from one place to another, but I never really felt like backtracking since I just didn't care much to do that. I was just following leads and instructions to get from one point to the next. This is largely due to the fact that this game tells you where to go, which kind of works against the Metroidvania element of organic discovery, and could have been a great way to pad out the game time in a way that was much more risky, but also could have made the game more engaging and provided that much needed room for contextual puzzles, and even puzzles that weren't just self-contained, one-off, single area things, but could have been larger scaled and forced the player to have to enter areas that they may come back to again and again with different contexts and even security clearances that make it crucial and incredibly rewarding to explore these areas since they look so damn good, and I wish that we could come back to some of these locations again and again with a new light, a new way to look at them. Exploring this place also doesn't feel entirely rewarding, and I'd love to clarify why. MCM is filled with a ton of secret logs from employees. These logs insinuate at a much less horrific but just as chaotic time as MCM encounters work issues as a direct result of Edwin Murray's unfortunate overworking and micromanaging of the entire workforce that caused a lot of them to jump ship. This is such an interesting story thread that painted Edwin as not just another unfortunate nice guy that had a bunch of bad stuff happen to him, but a much deeper character, and we'll be delving into that later, but a lot of those details are hidden in a huge amount of logs that don't provide any actual context to seemingly anything. Sure, someone can come by and say, oh, it helps with the world building, but the beautifully crafted environment already shows off that world building, and if text is required to build this world up, why can't it be in a more engaging format that respects the fact that the player bought a game to play? It puts me off how the earlier games did so much with so little. The first game only has about half a dozen pieces of lore-centric text, and all of it contributed to the vibes, the humor, the story, despite there being almost none genuinely planned at that moment. Small comment, but the logs for some reason show up in the order you collected them, even on New Game Plus. This is super annoying since I, as someone who might want to theorize about the contents of certain text in the game, have no actual timeline of when I found them and where, especially since you need to revisit a terminal to look at them. Honestly, the fact that logs exist at all in a FNaF game removes that FNAFness from it by treating us as half as smart as we used to be, which makes me think that their new games are going to continue to be catered towards a child audience first. I mean, it's what's gotten Steelwool and Scott Cawthon to continue being successful with the franchise after the 2010s, but is it really the move? Come on. When the logs and even voice memos at times have no real connection to what I want to know a lot of the time, it tends to remove any emotion from when I explore MCM's hidden corners. In my first playthrough, I wasn't thrilled by what I could find out. I was frustrated by what I didn't know.
Like, go back in time and tell somebody, like, oh my god, you loved FNaF 1? And they're like, FNaF 1? Yeah, there's gonna be a second one announced really soon. But in my future, we're so far along the FNaF timeline that we're fighting octopus bosses. And like, we're shooting at their tentacles to make them like, to make the game go by.
With Five Nights at Freddy's, there were always so many questions, more questions than answers, but there was always a thread to follow, something that made you excited for the future, made you excited to scroll on YouTube and look at MatPat's videos back in the day. Despite how crazy the lore would get, it was never through voice memos or logs, it was through pure, raw discovery. It was through the attention to detail, through solving elaborate codes and puzzles, through hidden content that made you itch for more. That single chest at the end of FNaF 4 was ironically a Pandora's box of ideas, theories, and potential lore, while these logs, for me, have no place in such a retrospectively profound piece of horror media. It's what signaled FNAF's downward spiral into unoriginality rather than a triumphant return to form. What else marked that unfortunate downward spiral besides Security Breach was the removal of what made FNaF so special in the first place, the thing that invented an entire subgenre of horror, the sit-and-survive gameplay formula. There's a complete lack of that more strategic and frantic gameplay I desperately wanted out of this game. Our once faceless and sometimes nameless characters that were a shell for the player to fill are now just some dude named Arnold that barely says anything of substance beyond a joke in the intro about him working 36 hours straight and being forced to do another job. This would have been such a deep commentary on how sometimes you're forced to overwork yourself to the worst extremes just to make ends meet money-wise, putting your life on the line or wasting the time you have with your own free life trying to maintain that same free life, with the hopes of getting out of the thicket someday, but instead it's sort of turned into this scene that attempts to be comical when, with a game that shows and doesn't tell, discovering who we are and our history could have come with the game as we played, rather than setting the story straight right away and removing most of the unknowns about the job and who we are. We're no longer theorizing about who we are. Mike Schmidt, Jeremy Fitzgerald, who we played as in these earlier games was a huge point of discussion, when here they tie up Arnold's personal arc at the beginning by explaining he's been overworking himself for the Fazbear Corporation for nothing basically in return. There's no mystery here, just a character that barely speaks throughout the game, and that would have been probably much more mysterious. Theory fuel almost, if he had just stayed completely quiet and had the handy unit explain what's going on in a more one-sided way that harkened back to the old phone calls we would get. yet. When this game made it abundantly clear that it'll be something that a bunch of horror games have done before, I was incredibly disappointed by the deliberate decision to remove the game from what made its own series so incredibly special from a gameplay and even storytelling perspective. The best part is, even when the original 6 games strayed from the cameras, doors, and offices, the one thing that stayed intact was the concept of sitting and surviving what's to come. Now, we get the exact opposite, on-the-rails chase sequences that have very minimal gameplay attached to them. Yes, they're mainly meant to be a test of the player's ability to think on the fly, but every chase sequence is more or less the exact same throughout every horror game that has one. Fundamentally, your goal is to find the way forward on a tight time limit. Everyone loves being chased by something, but having the entire thing be scripted removes that element of fear from it, realizing that your actions don't really affect anything. They're just a thing that opens the path forward and continues this cutscene, essentially. Dying in these parts is annoying, since having to redo something that is effectively just an interactive cutscene feels like a waste of time, and removes that feeling of something is chasing me, and instead replaces it with the feeling of, oh, now I have to run through that exact same hallway with that exact same enemy chasing me with the exact same animations and moments completely intact. Oh. Making these chase sequences less scripted and more of an active challenge that requires the player to think on their feet about a specific enemy's gimmick. Now that would have been much better instead of having Jackie chase me through a series of hallways and vents. Make it a puzzle in of itself to figure out something that makes Jackie stand out from the standard mimic and overall chase sequence design. It's having me figure out how Jackie works in an enclosed space, how to avoid her, how to counter her, and how to overcome her as a threat while potentially learning something new about the game that I can use later. It would have been cooler if the mimic controlling different animatronics provided it with different upsides and downsides. Like, remember Roxy from Security Breach? Like, that was kind of a cool moment. Why couldn't they do something similar here? One of the last things I'd like to mention is how annoying the part with the ghost cat suit was. This is the only place in the game where I was completely confused on how to combat it. I had chat tell me that they're not 100% sure, but staying in the light is super helpful. It was definitely frustrating because this is the only section in the game where I died a surprisingly high amount of times. This tiger cat was also teased earlier in the game, only to vanish and reappear a few hours later as the main threat in this entire area. Sure, I was terrified at first, but then it became annoying when I was completely unaware of how to really deal with it. While that uncertainty helps at first, there's very little room for error before you're sent right back, so if it were up to me, I would definitely crank the difficulty down just a bit in this area. Let me know if I just had an IGN moment, or if you also shared the same frustrations with this part, because I might just be really bad at this game and everybody might have really liked it. I don't know, it just kind of didn't hit the mark with me. On my first playthrough, I felt like I wasted about $50 to play this game, and I feel like to this day, that's still a lot of money to fork over for a FNaF game, especially one that is an improvement to the last mainline game, but not really something that exceeds the genuine feeling of the first 6 games. This experience would definitely be worth it at about half that price, so if you're ever feeling like you should play this game for yourself in the future, wait for a sale. Even after all the praise I give it in the future. At the end of the game, on my second playthrough, I found myself asking the question, what game is Secret of the Mimic trying to be? Because despite its missteps, I could see the potential of all these systems not only working on their own, but coming together so cohesively had they focused on making their game stand out amongst all the other horror game slop that exists. This game could have been not just big, but huge. I want the next game to surprise, to respect its own series history, and most of all, to respect its players for the time they put into it. Five Nights at Freddy's now seems as far removed from what it used to be as the name Five Nights at Freddy's is about a game that has nothing to do with Freddy and never lasts exactly 5 nights pretty much ever. I don't think I've even seen a single bear in this game. While my second playthrough had me asking that question, I'm glad I gave this game a second chance, because while this video could have been a huge rant about what this game did wrong until my own head begins to spin, that second playthrough painted a new context to this world and gave me a newfound appreciation for what this game was potentially reaching towards. For all its shortcomings, the pieces are in place for a proper masterpiece of a game to come in the future, and since this game is already a step up from Security Breach and Into the Pit exists, which I haven't yet tried but heard a lot of positive buzz around, that next game will truly be the game that tells us whether Stillwool really cares, or if mainline FNaF titles are forever bound to be games that have a ton of lost potential. Finally, I'm glad to say that there is something about this game that I found to be very unique and original. While permutations of it were done before, the hand mechanic was absolutely awesome. Controlling things with it was a lot more fun than you'd think, something was very immersive about a horror game in which your right hand, the one you typically use a mouse with, becomes a genuine piece of many of this game's puzzles, and even the UI. Gift boxes have to be unwound and opened. The pipe puzzle has to be rotated by you. The doors have to be physically opened by moving your mouse to the side to rotate the data diver. The game uses the hand to cleverly tell the player that they can interact with something without displaying a single word on screen. This is incredibly clever and contributes to the overall UI design, which is super minimalist and furthers the immersion of the game. There's no obstructive text on screen, no stamina bar or health bar even. You see what Arnold sees. The UI is actually so clean to the point where you aren't given access to any menus except the one that pauses your game and lets you tweak settings or leave the game. I'm happy they didn't feel like adding a VCR filter to the whole game, since so many games already do that when they take place in a more liminal looking area. While I understand that some people would be frustrated by a lack of an inventory or at least a menu where you can review things at any time, I deeply respect them for keeping the various terminals around MCM as the sole way to view any in-game menus and inventories. It changes the dynamic of the game, gives more use to the terminals and inventory system, and adds an extra layer of challenge, having to carry only one item at a time across the establishment to the nearest save zone. This contributes directly to a couple things. The player feels something by finding a collectible, whether it be excitement or dread, knowing you have to carry the item to a save zone without getting caught. The player also feels challenged by that very process of carrying the item to an inventory box. Lastly, the player is actively interacting with these save zones by carrying items to them and playing the moon.exe game found on the terminals. Great work, Steelwool. The only thing I would suggest as a developer is to never place two collectibles in the same spot or along the same path, since as a player, the most annoying thing for me was finding two collectibles in the same spot and having to carry them one by one to the office. It isn't fun. It adds to the negative repetitive nature I've spoken a bunch about before. Also, the house section during one of the endgame paths had you carrying a whole 5 tapes one by one into a room, while the mimic is actively surveying the area, which again is something the developers should avoid. This approach to the UI is not something that just makes the game less cluttered, it changes the game in a fundamental way, and overall, it's a breath of fresh air from security breaches' clunky and annoying menus. In my second playthrough, I also noticed how for the very first mimic encounter, it was wandering in a very specific way that didn't permit me to progress in the game. This is when, for the very first time, I used the distraction mechanic and gave myself the opportunity to barely make it past the mimic. Whether this was intentional during this moment or not, it really stood out to me. I only wish that we were urged to use these distractions more throughout the game, making it genuinely something that had its own use case. The developers shouldn't be afraid of putting the mimic down on a spot we really need to get to unless we're backtracking through an area. Shortly after that part, I fell into the void because the next area just didn't load. Come on, guys, this was a problem in the other game, but this time there wasn't a kill plane or teleporter at the bottom of the map that just puts you back somewhere. I just fell for a while. It really gave me time to think. It was silent. Very silent, to the point where I didn't even see what was above me anymore. It was just nothingness. I started to think to myself, what am I doing? This is like game development 101. Like, what's up with this? Anyway, the enemies. While I kind of said a couple negative words about the mimic earlier, I do think that the developers did a really good job in making this enemy terrifying in its own right. The idea that the mimic can be in any of these suits in a place that's filled to the brim with random mascot costumes is a genius idea that strikes at a player's fear through the feeling of paranoia. When looking at Five Nights at Freddy's as a whole, the earlier games had a lot of strategy to them. But when you booted up the game for the first time on night 1, each game had this feeling of helplessness, overwhelming, petrifying fear that not only glued you to your seat, but also the security guard that you played as. Later on in the 4th game, it was the dread of not seeing the enemy, but knowing it's there, and the paranoia that came from not knowing if that was just a noise, or if something is truly breathing into my face from the darkness right in front of me. Sister Location was about the unknown. You can't see anything sometimes. You can't tell what's after you except for a tiny glimpse at times. You don't know what you're doing here or what this location really is. The 6th game tapped into that paranoid, dreadful environment where you're not fully aware if that noise was real or not. You're not fully aware of how much you're in danger. All you know is that there are creatures here with you, and they'll eventually strike if given the chance. A couple games later, and with Secret of the Mimic, you have that lovely return to that paranoid atmosphere, knowing you're entering a tight hallway filled to the brim with abandoned, almost rotting suits that could very well reanimate at any moment, and the worst part is you never know which one or when. You just have to hope that you have the means to hide or take in your surroundings to find an exit before it begins its pursuit, or worse, catches you. The areas in which it patrols are also very well done, since I've always noticed in the fetch quest areas that the Mimic can go anywhere you can go. There's barely any safe areas, especially when trying to collect items to move the game forward. It's also much faster than you, so running is only an option to try and lose it around a corner, which is something you need to actively think about under a stressful moment. Simple, yet effective. With this game, we don't get security bots, we don't get teleporting animatronics, we get a grounded horror experience whose world is done on a much smaller scale than Security Breach, and thankfully, it is probably the best part about the game. The fact that they're not afraid to make things claustrophobic and almost suffocating in some areas, it plays tricks on you very nicely. Hiding places finally seem like they need to exist. They created an environment where they don't need animatronics to teleport to you anymore. They could just be where you are and be between you and the way out in a more organic way, which is why the Mimic is a genuine threat here. While the map is incredibly claustrophobic at times and looks really creepy, this is probably the best looking FNaF game I have ever played, and the map, while a little confusing, has so many set pieces that are very memorable to me, almost liminal in how they were executed. Take my favorite place in this game, the Big Top Theater. Why is this place my favorite? Well, it's because, man, just take this in. The warped music that sounds almost like an evil lullaby, the lighting, the big music man rotating slowly in a circle, casting a blinding light down on the ground in a room populated with mannequins in a strategic way that makes it a challenge to make it around this enormous robotic abomination. While this place has a pipe puzzle that you have to do 3 times, I forgive it because of just how nerve-wracking it is to have the music man attempt to follow you into this little room while you do the puzzle frantically. It's a moment in the game that takes this game's repetition and does something really good with it. The pipe puzzles are mostly different every time, the mannequins change position every time, and spinning this wheel, even though you're bound to lose 3 times before you get it right, is just the best part of this game for me. I loved it so much, I decided to put it in an entire segment of this video just to yap about it for a bit. What's interesting about this is that even though this entire section was free roam and still doesn't go back to those sit and survive roots of the franchise, it still ended up being an unforgettable experience for me, especially since it touches upon the doll-like creepiness of this game. It taps into the fear and nostalgia that simultaneously come from the liminal space-like design this area has. The repetition served to make you spend more time with this great area and wasn't too obstructive of this area's vibes and overall gameplay. This area here gets a 9 out of 10, which is carried by the vibes of it. It's short of that 10 out of 10 mark because of the repetitive shooting gallery games, which I didn't really touch upon, and the pipe puzzle's entire existence. But wait, I'm not done yet, because on my second playthrough, I discovered that you can enter other areas other than the Big Top area. I found my way into a little birthday place with some hidden secrets and a couple of Mimic encounters in some new areas, as well as some simple puzzles, which was incredibly rewarding to find and made me feel glad that I took the time to really look around. This game was bent on proving my first, more negative impression wrong, all because I was finally willing to look and play this game on its own terms rather than my own. It naturally led me to those places I otherwise would not have gone if I had played the game a second time with the same perspective as my first time. In an area of MCM, I found my way into the storytime area through a secret hole that I thought would lead me to a small prize with a collectible inside. To my surprise, it led me to a whole new area with more Mimic encounters, more things to look at. This was the reward I was desperately looking for with my first playthrough, and it only took trying to like this game to do it. And at that point, I began genuinely liking it. To make matters better, there was a door in this area all the way at the back that had a security clearance that I did not have at the time, which made me think that all that stuff I said about backtracking and Metroidvanias was false, and this game was in fact hiding those secrets that I desperately wanted to find. The only downside here is that there wasn't enough of a slow burn. While this security clearance check is here and you may need to backtrack if you don't have it yet, I ended up getting that upgrade 10 minutes after reaching that area anyway. This game almost did what I wanted it to do, and it demonstrates an understanding for being able to do it on a basic level, which is why this is something that still stands out to me today. One thing that made it interesting for me was to finish getting the security upgrade and wanting to make my way back to that door at the end of the storytime area and realizing that the way back was purposely blocked off, and I had the challenge of remembering or figuring out how to get back to that area and how to execute on that idea without dying somewhere along the way. It was a great, this game should have been a Metroidvania moment, which brings me to my next point. This game should have been been a Metroidvania. This game is so close to having an amazing Metroidvania-styled loop where your main goal as the player is to explore this enclosed area, this world crafted by some real talented artists and level designers, and take in everything, to learn the value of stumbling onto something new, to learn the hardship of reaching a dead end, to bring the community together when younger fans go online to read up how to get further into the game because they're probably stuck, which really helps the game reach new fans who stumble onto FNaF content online in a clever and organic way. With a loop like this, you don't even need half of these directions on the terminals. Just put explore Murray's costume manor in search of the Fazbear property and have the intercom guy only give you more information as an option if you get stuck. Not only would a Metroidvania approach help this game's visibility online, it would have gotten rid of the padding that's existent in the version we got in our real world, since this whole idea is just me spitballing with a bit of evidence to back it up. It'll also make it a lot more fun to make your way somewhere you probably shouldn't be and finding something you shouldn't have. Arnold as a character seems like an outsider to the real happenings inside of this establishment. Why not make that gameplay to story connection that allows the player to directly relate to Arnold, to feel out of place when they reach an area their curiosity and knowledge of the game's various devices led them to? It would have made collecting all these miscellaneous inanimate objects all the more exciting, rewarding, and generally just more fun. Finding secrets in the game is as cool as it is, but there's not much of a reward if you get them unless you get most of them. This different approach to the gameplay would have made it so much more interesting to find them, and would have almost amplified the emotions that may come from exploring every nook and cranny. Even in the areas where I get positive and wishful, we stray away from the actual game's contents. I think that's because this game has a lot, both good and bad, where the bad weighs the experience down and the good can be just a bit better because, well, the good can always be a bit better, and the bad stuff is usually on full display. I want to be fair to this game, but I cannot at all ignore what's happened before and how it marred my experience with Five Nights at Freddy's as a series. It did more than just make me feel like the series I loved is gone. It made me feel like I'm growing up, and that's why I can't like Security Breach or any FNaF game again, when that's just not true. But this game, while I keep yammering on about the bad and coming up with hypothetical scenarios where the game was much better in quality, I also want to try my best and still keep my eyes peeled for what it did well, because as you've heard before, there was plenty of good here. I think what's fascinating is how genuinely different both my playthroughs were from each other, and I think I've mentioned it more than twice already, but it goes to show how important a first impression is, how important it is that you continue to maintain a good image for your IP. If it weren't for Security Breach sucking so bad, I probably would have begun having a great time with this game. My first playthrough was clouded by frustration over the lack of Five Nights at Freddy's staple mechanics, such as the cameras, sitting and surviving, all seeming like a distant memory. A whole decade ago, we were swept up with each installment, one after the other, because of these core FNaF fundamentals. Through my second look at this game, I realized that these old mechanics were only given a new coat of paint, a completely new context this entire time. In the first game, cameras boiled down to a device that you use to get information, where the animatronic currently is, and in Secret of the Mimic, we're using it for the same reason, but instead of looking for where animatronics currently are, we're using it to get information that helps us solve puzzles, even though most of them are code puzzles. Yikes. In those older games, they also did a plethora of other things that they no longer do with this static image approach to cameras. They were the thing that gave you either comfort, knowing an animatronic is too far from you to do any sort of harm, or they were the thing that gave you this feeling of horror, knowing that an animatronic is so close to you that if you put down that monitor, you might be confronted by them immediately after. I think that with a pure 3D free roam environment, we didn't really need cameras, especially when we can peek around corners ourselves and are usually poked out of any comfort zones by the game's natural progression. So overall, the fact that they managed to still find a way to put them in the game, even with a different context, I really do think this was a nice feature, especially since deciphering some of the codes was honestly a bit fun because of them, even though they seem to be exactly the same on both my playthroughs. On one side, the codes are lazy, and on the other, we have this fun little way to solve them that reminds you just a bit of the old days. Sitting and surviving is no longer compatible with a game that's entirely trying to take the free roam route, but even though we usually have to move on and head through the next area and get a security upgrade, we're also constantly going through periods in which we actually kind of are sitting and surviving. When entering an office, sometimes you can see directly outside of it and be able to gauge what danger you're in, how close the mimic is to you once you open that door. Other times, you're forced to turn up your sound and really listen for where the mimic currently is before you exit the room. What's even better is that sometimes you're forced to sit in a locker, and while there's not much to see, there's a huge strategic element that comes into play here. Your vision is mostly obstructed, but Steel will deliberately added a feature that allows you to swing from side to see your surroundings with more detail. They knew that lockers were going to be a moment in which the player had to sit still and wait for things to blow over. This is almost no different than having a Freddy mask and waiting for the animatronic to leave your room. In the lockers, the mimic is usually strategically out of view or barely in view, so you have to rely on sound to make it out, and sometimes you straight up need to take risks. Is the mimic close enough to hear me if I leave? Is it looking at my locker right now? The mimic is faster than me, so if I mess this up, I could die. The mice you throw to distract your enemy are almost no different than the audio lures you use to distract Springtrap, although I still wish we got more mice-related conundrums. When you start thinking about this game as its own thing and get lost in its world and design without comparing it to Hello Neighbor or Bendy and the Ink Machine, you start to forget that this game is derivative of those games and start to think that this game is a soft reboot of the series in a 3D environment, a reimagining of those static, still gameplay mechanics in a more dynamic and unpredictable setting. Whether the 3D approach is a downgrade or not from the older games, that's up to you as the viewer, since I'm experiencing a moment of genuine indecisiveness on this topic. After looking back, I don't think I gave the Springlock suit assembly section enough credit, especially since I failed to mention, very strategically failed to mention, that what it actually demanded of the player was quite unique. Not all the pieces were just lying somewhere waiting for you to find them. Some were locked behind gates, doors, swinging chains, and rooms filled with suits. Not only did the mimic get faster every time you got a piece, you were always challenged to find out how to get to them under this pressure, teased by their presence through the gate and cameras before you found your way to them. It feels like if you can't find them after a bit of time, that's on you, not on the game. It doesn't feel like the Music Man section in Security Breach. No, each piece feels like it was deliberately placed in a position that had a challenge built into it, like being completely vulnerable when cranking this piece down, or having to figure out how to get to this piece behind the gates, or trying to move around the mimic fast enough to get this piece here in a place where it was patrolling, waiting for me. This fetch quest wasn't frustrating, which is such a great accomplishment for a fetch quest. I promised I'd get to this, but later on, way later on, when doing the elevator a second time, they cleverly forced the player to try and call back to the previous elevator puzzle by vaguely explaining certain parts of the instructions, like when Fiona says, close everything up, or leaving out certain details like what exactly rebalance the elevator means. They make you have to connect the dots yourself based on your prior time with the elevator. They challenge your memory here as well as your ability to work under pressure. But with the second one, it's less of a time pressure and more of a, are you really sure type of pressure. With the second and third elevator puzzles, this only amplifies because of the need to fill in the blanks, and also on the third time, there's this huge molten robot that's trying to kill you, which sort of does add a time pressure after all. For all I gave the elevators for their repetition, that repetition only really mattered to me when I didn't take the time to further look at what makes each of these elevator sections stand out individually. The second playthrough didn't convince me to give this game a more thorough look though. It was my initial curiosity of, is what I played truly all this game had to offer, that got me back into it. When I was proven wrong by just being curious, I felt happier and more satisfied with my entire playthrough, which led me to just want to play more. Because of my extensive attention to detail and the backtracking I did just because I felt like exploring the world by myself, I eventually found something that seemed like another big top set piece. Something that seemed like it recycled parts of this game but gave them a new context and a new way to experience them. Something that genuinely made me want to read up on this game's lore and figure things out on my own. It was when I found this part. This was when I truly felt rewarded for seeking out those secrets I missed the first time around. We're still doing that same old fetch quest, but this time our enemy glows in the dark, sounds creepy as hell, and there's this incredible contrast between light and dark. You have to take this little lamp star thing and put it on a pedestal, something that we should already know how to do by now. It lights up an area and opens a door to a pipe puzzle piece. All the pieces were just out of sight, and following the wires that led to the gates that block these puzzle pieces wasn't just a game of tracing the line. You had to actively watch where it was going and go off track to try and find it again, as it weaves in and out of the walls, all while this creepy moon is chasing you, always somehow following closely while you try to find the puzzle pieces. It was truly tense, and I might have died sometime along the way, but then I'm right back to finding one of the pieces. I think I should probably take just a second to mention that I'm glad that these developers really put in the proper time to set up autosaves at just the right moments. I feel like at some moments this game saves a little too much, but at the end, it definitely removes a lot of that frustration that comes from such an on-rails experience where the joy comes from moving forward, and moving backward seems more like rewinding a movie at times. I'm glad that for each individual piece of something in these fetch quest areas that you get a nice and quick autosave that makes it super tough to feel like you're restarting a large part of the game ever. I feel as though if they didn't have these autosaves as often as they do, this game would definitely suffer as a consequence and feel much more bloated and repetitive than it may sometimes feel like. This moon area really confused me, and I felt like I almost had no context going into it or even coming out of it, but man, I would be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. The feeling of finding something I didn't find before, the feeling of dread when you see the light approaching from around the corner, it made me want to think about this game, finally, which led me to finally taking a look at this game's story, even though I never really got to thinking much more about this moon part.
You weren't even supposed to be there. You were supposed to be here with me and David. Oh, how am I supposed to tell David that his mother is gone? How am I supposed to raise a kid on my own? His life is ruined. My life is ruined.
That was the most deadpan delivery I've ever heard.
I was largely disappointed by the story originally. Everything I didn't know frustrated me, and it felt like the answers were just meant to be vague and inexplicable to a certain extent. Scott Cawthon has already experimented with this type of story delivery with the first couple of games, where a lot of those important questions were never really meant to have an answer, but were rather something that brought the community together and had the internet piece together a story. All the for sure stuff happened after, seemingly. The Mimic is a relentless stalker that copies the mannerisms of those around it. It's a great idea for a villain, or a threat, something that contrasts William Afton very well. William Afton was a human-turned-monster. The Mimic is not quite a monster-turned-human, but it's something that makes you realize that humans are inherently monsters. We're creatures that think we're above being animals, when we also resort to primal instincts in danger. We're capable of killing. We're capable of stealing. We're capable of hurting other living things. While in most cases, animals hurt others to survive, whether it's a meal or to protect their young or to claim territory to thrive in, there's a lot of humans out there that are willing to hurt others for seemingly no benefit other than ego, to exert power over something or for some sadistic pleasure. William Afton was the worst of the bunch. He preyed on the innocent, arguably the most innocent and vulnerable people. He toyed with their lives and ultimately ended them for his own pleasure. In this game, William Afton was seemingly after a completely different type of control, one that seems more corporate, the takeover of MCM and ultimately the takeover of Edwin Murray's entire livelihood. To me, it seems like Fazbear Entertainment knew that MCM couldn't deliver what they asked for, and based on that, they used the contract to seize it all.
What the hell was that? They treat me like some contractor to crack a whip at. Oh, Fiona was right. They don't think of me as a friend anymore. This is the last project I ever do for them.
It was this, and a whole slew of other suspicious happenings, that caused the downfall of Edwin Murray. But Edwin, who made the Mimic, was never perfect even before the layers of stress began piling on. Edwin was a flawed boss, manager, leader, not quite sure what his title really is, and it was because he was quite a self-centered and egoistic person to begin with. He was someone that believed his inventions were groundbreaking, and they were, but he was always the one to have the last say in all of it. In a specific log, he mentions how he doesn't ever want his costumes used in sports, which could have been huge for him, doubling their sales, but Edwin declined almost rudely and dismissively, all because sports never did anything for him, so he shouldn't have to do anything for sports. Edwin's image didn't stop declining here. Because of how massively overworked he and his crew were, instead of taking an empathetic approach and doing a quick checkup on everyone to see if they had any ideas to keep them afloat, he instead antagonized them and monitored them to the point where they were forced to make a group chat to keep things under wraps and away from Edwin's ears.
Notice to all workers. All late-night shenanigans are to stop immediately. I have some very important TV people coming to look at the show template. I can't have the projector breaking again.
Some straight up couldn't take the work and left MCM, while others left while taking Edwin's ideas with them. To do what exactly? Not really sure, but there seems to be more than just normal coworkers being upset at their job situation here.
Attention traders, admin wing permissions have been revoked. And no, you can't clear out your desks. You stole my work. Now your jackets, purses, and coffee mugs, and anything else belongs to me. Maybe I'll go find someone to sell your stuff to. How does that feel?
His employees left him one by one because of his paranoid, egoistic demeanor and sheer ignorance for their well-being. They were upset at Edwin. It's basically confirmed in-game that at a certain time he lost his wife Fiona, presumably at the Fall Fest.
I have to go help the Fall Fest crew, just for a few days until the installation is finished. It's hard to explain. I just have this terrible feeling like I need to be there so nothing goes wrong, just in case.
Oh, why did you go? You weren't even supposed to be there. You were supposed to be here with me and David. Oh, how am I supposed to tell David that his mother is gone?
Whether this was an orchestrated death planned all along by Fazbear Entertainment or not is not for me to say. I myself am completely unsure about pretty much everything I mentioned in this section. I just think that these main characters have a lot of potential regarding their backstories and the themes that can be brought up as a result. Because you guys know me, I love those surface level themes that you could really just take a look at from a casual perspective, right? Edwin was pressured, put into a position he knew he couldn't fill.
This is all so much. He's gone. He's gone, and now everyone is asking me what to do? I don't know anything. I can't run a company. I'm not ready.
He got overambitious and overworked his crew, tired out all of his assets.
You're not going to want to hear this, but there's a lot of grumbling on the work floor. The staff can't keep up with all your changes. I think you need to step back a little, focus on one project at a time.
But from a personal perspective, he had to experience the sudden loss of both his wife and then eventually his son a couple years later. His reaction to his own wife's death comes off as really unnatural though, and I'm not sure if that was just a miscommunication between the voice actor and Steel Wool, but it feels like Edwin wasn't too rattled by her death. Wasn't thinking about her and her family, no. He thought about David and then ultimately himself, saying his own life is ruined because she's gone. Blaming her for going rather than blaming himself for not being there for her to guide her to make sure she's alright. He never seemed to have time for his family, even his son. He made the mimic because of his son. The mimic learned from its environment and the people around it, and somehow it became a caretaker for David by taking all the mannerisms and actions of Fiona, becoming this robotic version of her in the form of an endoskeleton, a shell of what she used to be.
Edwin, it doesn't make sense. It's terrible, and there's no logic behind it. It happened, and you have to deal with it. You did it before. We can fix things together. I am here to help.
Edwin, being the emotionally distant father he sort of is, made this mimic with Fiona's demeanor as a friend that became a replacement mother for him. That's gotta be the most messed up thing I've ever heard. If David really grew up and had a robot mother the whole time, wouldn't that change his entire perception of what a mother is? Would David have grown up resenting others for having real mothers, or resenting his own father for giving him a fake one? All of these questions would have probably been answered if he hadn't died as well, which I mean is fine. I mean, that's the way they decided to take this story. This is also alluded to be Edwin's fault, as well as his lawyers tell him specifically not to make a playground for David in a specific spot.
Look, I get your concerns. I do. But they're all just groundless. This is the perfect spot for David's playground. I can watch him play while I'm loading and unloading freight, and he'll be under watch at all time zones. The loading dock is like 200 feet away, and there's a fence and everything. I know you're my lawyer and all, but there's no regulation that says I can't have it there, so just get off my back. Besides, David loves the new slide. It'll be fine.
He ignores their warnings and tells them to lay off despite the danger he could be putting his own son in, assumedly. Accurately to his own ego and having to live with the voice of his wife around MCM and the additional loss of the only family he had left, he used his ingenuity to turn these people he has lost forever into living, artificial versions of themselves. They're not the same, but they're the closest thing he's got to the real versions of these people after their passing. But that'll never be enough, since when Edwin began to replace his own son the same way he did his own wife, it just wouldn't work properly, and from grief or frustration, Edwin resorted to physical violence, beating the mimic and thusly teaching it what humans are capable of when driven to the limit.
Stop. You're not him. You're not. Stop sounding like him.
My own adult look at this story may not at all be accurate, but it's the way I chose to understand it, since if you look at it through a mostly realistic lens, it really does add up. Yeah, sure, there's a random cat ghost that teleports everywhere, and there's the previous knowledge of the series taking a more paranormal approach in many cases, with the Remnant and a lot of possession of robot suits. This more human perspective, one that holds Edwin accountable, is one that I found to be really unique and just the thing I was looking for with the Five Nights at Freddy's lore. The story of the Mimic is one of humanity. It's up to us to decide whether Fiona truly is inside M1, or if M1 is just trying to be what Fiona was. It's up to us to decide how human the Mimic is. All we know is that the Mimic we see in the game is a relentless killer, one that only mimicked the hatred of Edwin, who was at his most vulnerable and broken to his core. The Mimic was what led to his death, but it was also the corporate entity that Fazbear Entertainment has made themselves out to be.
Never forget, they're behind it. Don't trust them. Never tell them. They want to destroy you. Dad was right.
It paints William Afton in such a different light now, since he's not only a child murderer, but he's also the ruthless owner of an increasingly invasive company that tore down the Murray family, the Murray name, and eventually their trust in Arnold was what released the Mimic into the outside world. As an adversary, the Mimic is a genuinely well-written enemy, not only in the sense that it can fit in any costume with basically no constraints, but it is meant to be a stalker, and it feels like a more animalistic threat rather than a calculated one. It's a great commentary of humans to have a robot that is meant to mimic them, but ultimately becomes as destructive as the species that made it. So be nice to ChatGPT just in case, okay, everybody? At the end of the video, I want to finally answer my questions. Is this a good video game? Yes, I think it was ultimately worth my time, but only because I trusted it. It was because of my distrust in the franchise as a whole that I couldn't enjoy this game properly on my first time through. I think it'll be a perfect game to play if you're waiting for a sale and really want to experience it firsthand. These games still sell well, and they would probably sell a lot better if they take it a step further and make sure to keep those older fans in mind, those same older fans that loved that exact formula that had them glued to an office, or a bedroom, or whatever this is. While there are probably millions of FNaF fan games out there, ones that are incredible and intricately designed to expand on those same formulas that are found in the original 6 games, ultimately it's up to Steel Wool and Scott Cawthon to continue making games that pave the way for the fan games that follow. Which also leads me to the answer of my next question. Is this a good Five Nights at Freddy's game? This, at first, was a hard no, but over time, I started to really like the game on that second playthrough. The only problem is that those elements that I mentioned before, the static cameras, the hiding in lockers and in office rooms, even if they were a new way to look at those key pillars of the old FNaF formula, they don't quite do enough to make this game stand out as something that's in the same series as The Bite of 87. It seems like this game, while it is a step up from Security Breach, is also a game that unfortunately removes itself further from a lot of what made its own series so special. So how do we make it better? Well, I loved the 3D movement in this game, the running and hiding and the near misses and losing the Mimic around the corner. It was an almost exhilarating experience. If you combine that gameplay with the old, not entirely melt them both into one experience, but have it be like an A and B gameplay loop where you're forced to spend time roaming and exploring, and then you're in an office defending yourself for an objective, now that would be great. If you combine that with the previously mentioned Metroidvania-styled gameplay for the free roam sections, you'd have yourself a truly unique horror experience as a whole, one that I don't think has ever been done before, one that seems outlandish almost, and risky for sure, but one that hasn't been attempted by anyone else as far as I know. So if you're listening, Steel Wool, take some time to really cook with the next one. Take like 2-3 years, and don't forget to put me somewhere in the special thanks because I'm awesome. Thanks so much for watching this entire video. I know it was long, but you're here now, and I think you're awesome for it. Hell, I think you're awesome for just clicking on this video, but you won't get to hear it unless you've gotten to this moment. I just want to make a few short announcements before I end the video. Thanks to your amazing support, I am now monetized. Sorry for the ads, just know that this supports my future content. So thank you for getting me here, and thanks again for sitting through that whole video. I also have channel memberships now, so if you want some extra content, bonus shorts of upcoming content before it's out, and some extra cool exclusive stuff, feel free to join the channel as a member. I also stream roughly twice a week over here on this channel, so catch a stream if you see I'm live and say hi.
I don't even hear her anymore. Oh, and I'm dead. I just burnt myself alive.
We do some really crazy stuff there. I've been working on a Zelda randomizer game that you can play through the chat whether you know Zelda or not. So if you like Zelda or are curious and like the random silliness of life, you'd want to catch a stream. Otherwise, you could watch me get so grassed up that I do stuff like this.
Boom, hover bike done.
Alright, that's about it from me. I'm gonna go and get that Tears of the Kingdom video started. Leave a comment below if you have any game suggestions. Oh, and take care, and don't forget to brush your teeth.